This is the DJI Mini 3 Pro. We're gonna go test it.
Hey, my name's Jake and I create content here to help solo creators on the go. So I test and review drones, cameras, lenses, filmmaking equipment here in Alaska, and I give you tips and tutorials on how to use them. If that's something that interests you, consider subscribing. Today we've been testing and working with, well actually I've been working with this for several weeks now, but the Mini 3 Pro from DJI, which is, I think, possibly the most ideal drone if you do stuff like this that I do here, hiking, lots of travel, stuff like that, because of the size, the weight, and the incredible performance out of the latest version of this tiny drone. I gotta say, I'm not sponsored by DJI. I bought and paid for this myself. I had to wait 4 weeks for it to come to me. And so these opinions are 100% my own after using this drone almost exclusively for the last few weeks. So we have to start off by talking about the image quality, and let's start with video. Video has taken a big step up, partly and mostly because DJI has given us 10-bit color in this drone with D-Cine-like. Now, D-Cine-like isn't a log profile, it's just sort of a flat color profile, but it does give you a lot more room to color grade and to push and pull colors in post. And because it's 10-bit, you actually can really push and color grade this image quite a bit. Now, also, the image quality is taking quite a bit step up, even though we're still limited to 4K 60, 4K 30, that's the highest resolution we can go. But it has taken a big step up also because of the larger sensor size that's in this. It's a 1/1.3 inch sensor instead of a 1/2.3 inch sensor. So it's a lot larger, it lets in a lot more light, and it does a lot better. And I have to say, I'm impressed by the image quality coming out of this. 4K 60 gives you a little bit of slow-mo at a really nice high resolution, so you get really good quality in 4K 60. You can also get slow motion up to 1080p, up to 120 frames a second, which is pretty good. The 1080, 120 frames a second, definitely soft, definitely a little mushy, but it is pretty good slow motion overall. And then you come into 4K 30, 4K 48, 4K 24, all of those, or 4K 25, depending on where you are in the world. But those are what they call HQ mode, which is kind of a sort of hybrid HDR mode. I haven't really figured that out yet, but it definitely gives you a little bit more extended ability to see highlights and shadows than if you were not shooting in 4K 30 or 4K 24 or something like that. Definitely gives you really nice quality video, and I've been spectacularly impressed. But another upgrade that DJI made is giving us a much more open aperture, so you can let a lot more light in. This is an f1.7 instead of an f2.2 or 2.8, depending on what drone you've talked about, or 2.4. That lets in a lot more light. In case in point, on days like this, I have to use ND64 just to be able to get the exposure down around where I need it. But that is spectacular for low light performance, and the low light performance on this drone is actually much, much better than I thought it would be. I think it's even rivaling the Air 2S. You can see a whole comparison video. It'll pop up here in the corner. The low light performance of this drone is spectacular. I shot a bunch of hyperlapses, I shot a bunch of low light video, and you can see here examples of video at ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, and ISO 1600. Now definitely at 800 you start to see some noise and noise reduction kick in, and at 1600 the image definitely starts to fall apart. You could use it for social media, be fine, but anything else, I definitely wouldn't use it for that. But that's not all. We also have to talk about photos. As far as photo quality goes, this drone does take nice photos. You get the option of RAW and JPEG. Unfortunately, you don't get the option of just RAW yet, but maybe DJI will give us that in the future. But the RAW photos are nice to work with. They have a fair amount of latitude, but you are limited to 12 megapixels, except for that this is a quad Bayer sensor, which means you can divide the sensor up into 4, and then you get a 48 megapixel still. Now, it's not the same 48 megapixels that you would get if you had APS-C size or a full frame 48 megapixel camera, but it does give you more definition and more detail, somewhat, and it's noticeable. It's not massive. So 12 or 48, either one of them look really nice. They're good, clean images, and they're easy to work with. And actually, I was surprised how much dynamic range this drone has for being able to edit these photos in post. So along with the option of doing 12 or 48 megapixels, you also get auto exposure bracketing for 3 or 5 shots, which I use all the time with drones because it just gives you a lot more. You can make sort of an HDR image, or you can just pick the best exposure that you like. And you can do timed shots where the drone will take a photo automatically every 3 or 5 or 10 seconds, whatever you want it to be. So if you want to get photos of yourself doing something like this insane up on a mountaintop, you can do that without having to push a button and hold the controller or make it look like you're trying to look like you're not flying a drone. And related to, but not exactly related to, photo quality is hyperlapse mode. I've shot a bunch of hyperlapses now with this drone, and to be honest, they can turn out really good. But there is one downside, and that's because this drone is lightweight, and you'll notice this in a ton of stuff, it does get blown around and pushed around by the wind quite a bit. So you either have to be very meticulous about editing the raw data or the raw photos from those hyperlapses to get in actually a really nice smooth one, import all those into your non-linear editor, your video editor, and create the hyperlapse yourself, and then stabilize it really heavily to be able to get something this good and this smooth. I'll have a whole video coming up, and whenever it does go live, maybe it'll be linked up in the corners here somewhere. And of course, you also get wide angle panoramic shots where the drone will stitch those shots together. You can save the raw files and stitch them together yourself, which does give you a lot of different options for being able to take photos, including 360 photos. And of course, you also can rotate the gimbal horizontally or vertically 90 degrees, which gives you vertical photos and vertical video, but vertical photos, which I actually really enjoy taking and really love. Certain things like waterfalls, stuff like that, just really lend themselves well to vertical photos. Another big upgrade they gave us is actually giving us 3 directions of obstacle avoidance. You get forward, down, and rear obstacle avoidance, which is fantastic because that enabled them to give us also active track and a lot of different smart shots like master shots, which you can see here. This just gives you a lot more options for how you can film, how you want to film, what you want to use this drone for, and especially for solo creators, being able to use something like master shots or being able to use something like active track to be able to get shots that you just don't have to work so hard to control the drone while you're filming yourself is absolutely fantastic. The obstacle avoidance does work well. The APAS does work well. I haven't tested it against something like the Skydio or something like that yet, but I will say I think it works forward and backward at least, as well as the Mavic 2, the Air 2S, the Air 2, and maybe even as good as the Mavic 3 does, which is pretty spectacular. Again, no side obstacle avoidance, so you got to be careful about that, but the forward and rear obstacle avoidance does work very well. And this is where we come to performance. There have been a lot of complaints about range. I've pushed this drone out to 35 to 4,000 feet, which I'm telling you is the absolute max that you can see this drone out there. And I had to put a strobe on it to keep my eyes on the drone when it was going out. So that's a long way. It definitely doesn't have the signal strength of something like the Mavic 3 or the Air 2S. Partly, I think that might be due to just the design of the drone, is there's nowhere for the antennas to come down. Like there used to be little feet that came down, and so depending on where the antennas are inside of this drone, it just makes it a little bit more difficult to get that same range. That being said, I've been very happy with the amount of range that I've gotten and been able to fly around like through trees and stuff like that without losing visual video sync. Another upgrade on this drone that I did not expect is how quiet it is. This is by far the quietest drone I've ever used and ever flown. Here's a sample of what it sounds like. It's the noise test of the Mini 3. It's right here, arm length in front of me, so it's between me and the camera, about 4 feet from the camera. The fact that I can talk to the camera with the drone between me and the camera using an on-camera shotgun mic and not have to raise my voice is absolutely incredible. And what that means is if you push this drone 50, 60, 70 feet away, you really can't hear it at all. That's both a plus and a negative. If you're used to be able to help like find your drone wherever you're flying by the sound, you're gonna have a much more difficult time with that now. On the other hand, this drone is much nicer if you want to fly in places that you don't want to disturb people or you just don't want to draw a lot of attention to yourself while you're flying your drone. But also on performance, we've got to talk about the battery life. So with the 259 gram battery, which keeps the whole drone under 259 grams, very important if you don't want to register it or if your country has much more strict rules on drones over that weight limit. But with that, I've been getting 26, 28, 29-ish minutes of flight time, depending on how I'm flying and the conditions I'm flying it in. And then with the plus size batteries, the longer run batteries, which put your drone over that weight limit, over that 259 grams, I've been getting about 36 to 38 minutes of flight time, again, depending on conditions, which is spectacular. It's really great. It means I don't have to charge my batteries as often or take as many batteries with me. But also because these are USB-C rechargeable, I can take a power bank and recharge them pretty much anywhere I am. So that's what I've been doing today is as I've been using batteries, I put them in the little carrying case or the little 3-case thing, which is plugged into a USB port or USB power pack, and then that starts recharging those batteries. So essentially, I can pretty much do everything I want to do all day long with these 3 batteries and this 1 USB power bank. All this stuff this extra stuff is all linked in the description. And also in the performance category comes to speed and wind. I've been able to ascend and descend at up to about 8.5 miles an hour, ascending and descending, which is pretty good. Not as fast as the Air 2S, not as fast as the Mavic 3, but definitely not too bad. And as far as the fastest I can go forward, it's been about 35 to 36 miles an hour pretty consistently, regardless of conditions. Now, I've also flown this in some very high winds, 20, 25, even 30 miles an hour with some 30, 35 mile an hour gusts. And the drone has handled it well, but this is where the downside of these very small and very lightweight drones comes into play is if you're close to an object while you're filming, you will see a lot of movement in the footage. It'll still be smooth because the gimbal is going to smooth it out, but the drone will move a lot just because it's so much smaller and so much lighter weight. It has a much more difficult time fighting against higher winds. So that's something you need to be aware of. If you go to a lot of places where you're going to experience high wind, this might not be the drone for you. And one of the things that I've absolutely loved about this, even though it's expensive, is the new remote controller. It is great. The battery life is great. Having a built-in screen is fantastic. I enjoyed it. I've seen no discernible difference in range between this and the standard controller. So if that's something you're on the fence about, I haven't seen any difference when I've tested them. But I do really like this new controller. Having 2 wheels is great. The extra custom button is really nice. And the fact that you have a screen built in that's a little brighter than my iPhone screen, but I don't have to worry about plugging in my iPhone every single time is absolutely fantastic. One thing that's astounding about this remote controller too is that it's incredibly lightweight. The Mini 2 was to me one of the best starter drones because of its performance and the price point that you got it at $500 or sub $500. This is much more expensive at $900. Now, if you have the RCN1 remote or whatever the standard remote is from DJI, yes, you can buy this for $600 pretty soon. It's not shipping yet, but apparently it will, like in August or something. However, I do love this remote and I think it's worth it, but it does push the price up to $1,000. And then if you add the Fly More kit on there for another $250 or so, you're pushing into the $1,200 range, $1,150, $1,200. And that starts to get really expensive when you could also get an Air 2S. Now, they're very different drones, different uses, obviously different weights and stuff like that, so that might be your deciding factor. And I'm not saying that this price isn't worth it for this drone, it just is getting expensive and definitely not something I would recommend for beginners. Now, if you want to see how this drone stacks up to other drones, click or tap right there. I put together a little playlist comparing it to the Mini 2, the Air 2S, etc. If you want to see how to set this drone up and the settings that I use for mine, click or tap right there. I'll take you through how I set my drone up. As always, if you have questions, ask me in the comments below or join my live stream Wednesday nights at 4 p.m. Alaska time, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Cheers.